Now that you're familiar with the fundamentals of the JavaScript language, we need to talk about JavaScript releases or versions before moving on. And we briefly talked about this in the intro video, but now let's go into more depth because it's really important to know about how JavaScript releases work and how we can use them. It's important for your work as a web developer and also because you will see these topics coming up in the developer community all the time. And so you want to be able to understand what's going on. And the best way to start understanding JavaScript versions is by looking at the history of JavaScript. So let's do that. And let's start at the beginning of the internet itself. So quickly after the internet was invented and the first web browsers were developed, developers wanted to start making websites more interactive. In other words, they needed a programming language for the browser. So in 1995, the Netscape Navigator, which by the time was the dominant browser, hired a guy named Brendan Eich to create the very first version of JavaScript in just 10 days. It was called Mocha, so not JavaScript yet, but it already had many of the fundamental features that modern JavaScript has today. So that's very impressive that he basically created this first version in really just 10 days. Then in 1996, Mocha was renamed to LiveScript, which was then again renamed to JavaScript for one simple reason: to attract developers from the hottest language at the time, which was Java. So the Java in JavaScript was really just for marketing reasons, because the language itself has basically nothing to do with Java. Now, some beginners think that this is the case, but actually no. JavaScript and Java are two completely different languages. Also in 1996, Microsoft launched the Internet Explorer, which basically copied JavaScript from Netscape. But they called it JScript for legal reasons because, well, you actually cannot just go around and copy other people's programming languages. Now, what this means is that we now had two very similar but competing languages, which of course is never a good idea in the long run. And so, with the internet growing like crazy around this time, people realized they needed to standardize JavaScript. So the language was submitted to an independent standard organization called ECMA, which in 1997 released ECMAScript 1 or ES1. This was the very first official standard for the JavaScript language. And with this, every browser could now implement the same standard JavaScript. In the real world, we usually use the term ECMAScript to refer to the standard, while JavaScript is used when we talk about the language in practice, as it's implemented in browsers. Now, fast forward to 2009, after a lot of complications and disagreements about where the language should be headed, ES5 was released with a lot of great new features. And then finally, another 6 years later, the much-awaited new version ES6 was launched in June 2015. And this was the single biggest update to the language ever. So it contained a ton of new exciting features, which we will explore throughout this entire course. This was and still is a really big deal for JavaScript and for the whole web developer community. Now, you will also see ES6 being called ES 2015, which is actually the official name, but most people just call it ES6. And so that's what I'm going to do here as well. And actually the reason for ES6 being called ES 2015 officially is that in 2015, ECMAScript changed to an annual release cycle. So right now, there's going to be a new release every single year. The reason for that is that they prefer to just add a small number of new features per year instead of shipping a huge new version every couple of years like it happened with ES6. And so this way, it's going to be much easier for everyone to keep up to date. And so according to this new annual release cycle, in 2016, ES 2016 or ES7 was released, ES 2017 in 2017, and like this, it will continue until the end of time, or something like that. Now, there is one particularity about JavaScript releases which is pretty unique for any programming language, and that is backwards compatibility all the way to ES1. So what does that actually mean? Well, basically it means that if you were to take some JavaScript code written back in 1997 and put it in a modern browser with a modern JavaScript engine today, it would still work just the same. So again, the JavaScript engine that's in our browsers today is able to understand old code written 25 years ago without having to rely on version numbers or anything like that. It just works. And it works this way because of the fundamental principle that's baked into the JavaScript language and its development, which is to not break the web. This means that there is almost never anything removed from the language, but only added in new versions. And actually, we cannot really call them new versions even, because they do not contain breaking changes like when other languages move to a new version. Instead, new versions are always just incremental updates which add new stuff. And so I like to call them releases and not versions. The ECMAScript committee who works on updating the language does all this so that old websites basically keep working forever. Just imagine they removed some important feature that made a website from 2008 work just fine. If you then wanted to visit that page, it would be broken. And that's why we, fortunately, have the don't break the web principle. Now, of course, this comes with problems, because there are tons of old bugs and weird things in the language. Remember that Brendan Eich made the very first version in just 10 days. And no one back then could even imagine what JavaScript would be used for one day. The initial goal of JavaScript was just to add some simple dynamics to pages, not to write whole web applications in the browser like we do today. But anyway, these bugs and weird quirks in the language have been giving the language a bad reputation among many programmers, who can't really take JavaScript serious because of this. But here's the thing. We can actually go around many of this weird stuff by simply learning the modern JavaScript that matters today and just ignore most of the old weird stuff. And so that's exactly what we're going to do in this course. So next time your friends start hating on JavaScript, and believe me, this actually happens, then just tell them about the amazing things that you can build with it. Okay, but now there is one more thing that we need to talk about here, and that is forwards compatibility. So what do you think would happen if we took this totally made up code from the year 2089 and tried to run it in today's browsers? Well, you're probably right, it would not work at all. There would be errors left and right, and nothing would work. That's why we say that JavaScript is not forwards compatible. Basically because current browsers do not understand code from the future. And this actually brings us to our next topic, which is how can we use modern JavaScript today? Because browsers that users are using might be old, and there is no forwards compatibility, right? So to answer the question how we can use modern JavaScript today, we need to consider two distinct scenarios, development and production. So the development phase is simply when you're building the site or application on your computer. To ensure you can use the latest JavaScript features in this phase, all you have to do is to use the most up-to-date version of the Google Chrome browser. This will then ensure that all the features I show you in this course will work for you as well. The second scenario is production, which is when your web application is finished, you deploy it on the internet, and it's then running in your users' browsers. And this is where problems might appear, because this is the part that we actually can't control. We cannot control which browser the user uses, and we also can't assume that all our users always use the latest browsers, right? Now, the solution to this problem is to basically convert these modern JavaScript versions back to ES5 using a process called transpiling and also polyfilling. We will use a tool called Babel later in the course to transpile our code, but for now, during the course, we won't need that. Again, because you're using the most up-to-date browser during development. Transpiling back to ES5 is only necessary after your app is developed and you want to ship it to your users. Alright, so now let's take a look at how different JavaScript releases can be used today. So first off, ES5 is of course fully supported in all browsers today, all the way down to Internet Explorer 9 from 2011. So we can assume that ES5 is safe to be used at this point, which is the reason why we use it as a target for transpiling. Now about the newer releases ES6, ES7 and all the way to ES 2020, as of mid-2020, they are actually quite well supported already in all modern browsers. And we usually call all the current versions together ES6 Plus. So right now that's from ES6 to ES 2020, and basically all together they are the modern JavaScript. Now it's in this modern JavaScript, so in this ES6 Plus, where transpiling comes in, as I mentioned earlier. Again, because it's not safe to assume that all our users are using these modern browsers, and we don't want to break our app for them, right? And by the way, if you want to stay up to date with what features are currently supported in which browser, you can check out the ES6 compatibility table. It's really interesting. The link is actually on my resources page on jonas.io. Next, there are also the future releases of the language, like ES 2021, ES 2022, and so on. And these future releases together are many times called ESNext. Now, why is this even relevant? Well, because most browsers actually start implementing new features even before they enter the official ECMAScript specification. That's possible because as new features are proposed, they have to go through 4 stages, starting with stage 1, where they are first submitted, all the way to stage 4, at which point they enter the language officially. But when a feature is at stage 3, browsers can be pretty sure it will eventually pass to stage 4, and so they're going to start implementing that feature while still in stage 3. And there is a lot more to be said about this, and actually I find this really fascinating, but I'm going to stop here. You can find tons of information about this online if you want to learn more. And a great place to start is actually, once more, this compatibility table that's up here on the slide. But anyway, as these new features start coming out, I will simply add new videos about them to the course in order to keep it updated. With the annual release cycle, this is now way easier to do, because there will be no drastic changes to the language like ES6 was. Okay, and now to finish, let's quickly talk about how versions, or releases, are taught in this course. So, as I said earlier, I will teach you modern JavaScript right from the beginning of the course. Now, I used to teach this course starting with ES5 and then moving to ES6 in the middle of the course. But now, after a couple of years, it was time to fully move to modern JavaScript. However, it's also super important to learn how some things used to be done before we had this fancy modern JavaScript. For example, in this section, I already showed you the modern const and let for variable declarations, but also how we used to use var before. And there will be many more examples like this. But why bother with ES5 at all, you might ask? Well, here is why. First, you will better understand how some features in JavaScript actually work behind the scenes. For example, ES6 classes, which hide all the implementation details of object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Also, many tutorials and example code that you will find online are still written in ES5 today. Plus, as a developer, in many jobs, you will actually have to work on older code bases. And it's totally possible that that code base might still contain a lot of ES5 code. Okay, so I hope that made sense. And that's it for this lecture and for this section. So see you in the next one.